look at the fact at every turn, our constitutional allocation of powers is being ignored or violated, particularly by the president, but also by Congress, and it's acquiesced in by the Supreme Court. So let me explain a little bit. Under the Constitution, of course, our three branches of government enjoy limited powers, powers allocated by the Constitution, which was written and ratified by the American people, and it represented our opportunity as the sovereign authority in the country to say, essentially, as James Iredell of North Carolina said in the aftermath of the Constitutional Convention, that we allocate particular powers and particular responsibilities, and we engage in a particular division of power. We've not allocated a blank sheet of paper. Thus, it was clear then, as it should be now, that our governmental officials are required to adhere to the Constitution. To ignore or to violate the Constitution, as George Washington said, would mock the very concept of popular sovereignty and the right of the people to engage in government by consent. And what we've witnessed over the last 6 months, and it's pretty remarkable, because when you and I spoke last time, the Trump administration was just getting started. What we've witnessed here in the last 6 months has been a steady assault on the Constitution. We have seen President Trump aggrandize congressional powers in a way that we've never seen before. And I'm talking about presidential usurpation of the congressional spending power, that is the power over appropriations, the congressional power to engage in lawmaking. It's undermined the authority of Congress to engage in oversight, and it's usurped the appointment power. And I could go on and on. Many examples of presidential aggrandizement of congressional power. And this is essentially a terrible sin against the Constitution. George Washington said during his first administration, as he wrote letters to friends, the greatest fear I have as president would be to be accused of being a usurper, a four-letter word in those days. I would not want any of my fellow citizens to accuse me of usurping constitutional powers, because that would represent not only a violation of my duties to take care to faithfully enforce the laws, but it would also recommend that I should be removed from office, because a usurpacious president essentially would be guilty of denying the right of the people to participate in the government that they've created. And so we've seen Congress then acquiesce in the face of presidential power. And that raises an equally profound concern, because the Congress does not have the right, doesn't have the authority to ignore its duties and responsibilities under the Constitution. Indeed, the Supreme Court has said many times that is a predicate of the doctrine of separation of powers, that no branch of government may abdicate its powers. And so what Congress has done, and let's be precise about this when we talk about Congress, we are talking about the GOP-controlled Congress in both the House and the Senate. And the majority party has stood by and not only watched the usurpation by the president of its fundamental constitutional powers, but it's acquiesced. And so Congress is failing to carry out its powers, and that represents an affront to the doctrine of checks and balances. And what we've seen lately is that the Supreme Court has been enabling the president through decisions on the emergency docket, allowing the president, for example, now to deport immigrants to nations that are not their own countries, to foreign nations that are war-torn, that engage in persecution and torture without any significant or substantial due process. If you are arrested by our government or detained by our government in any way, you have a right, as a matter of due process of law, to be informed of the charges against you. And then, and this is the key part, you're supposed to be given adequate notice so that you can contact an attorney to represent you, have a hearing. The Supreme Court has acquiesced essentially in President Trump's uh, program designed to snatch people from the streets, whisk them away to other countries in violation of due process. So, indeed, Stacy, we are in a constitutional crisis. We've never seen the Constitution stampeded in this way, one in which all three branches of government are complicit. And it's gotten so severe that many scholars, and I'm included in this, are now saying that we've approached constitutional failure. This has grave consequences for the rule of law. We wonder, does the rule of law still apply, particularly because the president, who swears an oath to uphold the law of the land and has, under the take care clause of Article 2 duty, the responsibility to faithfully execute the law, which means Supreme Court decisions, is in fact ignoring, defying Supreme Court decisions. So, indeed, we're in a constitutional crisis and we're approaching constitutional failure, and we begin to wonder, how do we pull ourselves out of this abyss? How do we right this wrong direction?
Thank you for laying that out so clearly, because I think it's with everything flooding the zone, it's hard to kind of keep up with what's going on. And my I had was going to ask you actually, what's the role of the judiciary in administration where it's, an elected president with a sympathetic Congress where they're all from the same party, and you explained that very well. Thank you. So I think most of us are familiar that the power to make law lies with Congress, right? They are the only ones who get to create the law. The president can influence lawmaking through the veto power, but he doesn't directly create laws. And then the judiciary can interpret it and strike down laws. So my question is, what is an executive order and what power does it actually hold?
Yeah, that's a good question. The president has the authority to issue executive orders, which are rules to members of the officials in the executive branch, based on his authority derived either from a statute or the Constitution. And in order to be legal, in order to comply with the Constitution, the executive orders have to be grounded in one or the other. And historically, presidents going all the way back to George Washington have issued executive orders, many of which have been non-controversial, carrying out essentially housekeeping rules. Some have been more significant, how to carry out authority granted by Congress, for example, to set up postal agreements with other nations. Congress says to the president, we want to be able to receive mail from other countries. We want to send mail. So you carry out that responsibilities. Others have during wartime uh, been issued by the president as commander in chief to direct the movement of troops, for example. And then some have been not only very controversial, but held unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. Some will remember that the Supreme Court in the landmark decision in 1952 in the steel seizure case rebuked President Harry Truman for issuing an order to his Secretary of Commerce, Sawyer, to seize the steel mills during a national steel strike to keep them open and operating. And the court said the president has no authority to seize private property, and so held it unconstitutional. And so there have been some executive orders then that have been notorious and unconstitutional. Some of our listeners will be familiar with the really tragic executive order issued by FDR in February of 1942, carrying out the request by the military to remove Japanese American citizens from their homes in California, removing them to camps in the interior. And while that also was based on a statute, Congress participated, the Supreme Court upheld it. It was years later that essentially our government apologized and issued reparations to those Japanese American citizens who were deprived of their property and whose lives were assailed with, I think, $25,000 apiece, a pittance, really, but at least a meaningful gesture. And so presidents do engage in executive orders. President Trump has issued in this 6-month period far more executive orders than any of his predecessors have in a comparable period of time. He has essentially resorted to government by executive order, and many of them, frankly, have violated the Constitution in gross ways. Let me provide you with an example that will hit home in South Dakota, particularly as the Humanities Council has been affected, as have state humanities councils all across the country. Uh, the the so-called Department of Governmental Efficiency created by President Trump was the result of an executive order. But we should be clear that the president has no authority under the Constitution to create an office or a department. That's a legislative power. So he usurped the lawmaking power of Congress when he created that department called DOGE. And then DOGE, as you know, proceeded to inflict massive cuts all across the federal government and brought the axe to the funding for the NEH, National Endowment for the Humanities, which is a primary source of revenue for the South Dakota Humanities Council and others across the country. And those were essentially illegal cuts, unconstitutional usurpation of the appropriations power of Congress. Only Congress can determine how to spend American taxpayer dollars. The president usurped that power. Congress again sat on its hands and acquiesced in that aggrandizement of power. And so the executive orders have been issued by President Trump that have violated numerous provisions of the Constitution, and still we've seen no outrage from the majority party in Congress, and that means it's participating in this series of presidential acts of aggrandizement of power.
Something that you said where when you brought up history reminded me of the concept of an imperial presidency.
Mm-hmm.
What is an imperial presidency, and how is it relevant or not relevant to what we're seeing now?
It is. I love that question. The term imperial presidency was invented or unleashed by Arthur Schlesinger Jr. in 1973 in a prize-winning book. Schlesinger was one of the nation's leading historians, twice the winner of a Pulitzer Prize. And in this book, The Imperial Presidency, he described how the American presidency had grown imperial, that is, king-like, over the years, but particularly by its usurpation of foreign affairs and war-making powers in the 1960s during the Vietnam War. And he identified particularly Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon for their usurpation of the war power. And the point that he was making, and I admire Schlesinger very much. In fact, early in my career, he wrote a foreword to one of my books on the Constitution and foreign policy. So I was always indebted to him. At any rate, he made the point that the president is imperial abroad, and then that carries with it certain implications for domestic activities by the president. And for ever since the 1960s, the imperial presidency has largely applied only to the foreign relations realm, but it's been applied much more expansively now in the presidency of Trump, who has become essentially an imperial president over all domestic matters. He said, he referred to himself in a speech in New York as King Donald. And I think he said that tongue in cheek. He has, of course, engaged in a massive concentration of power in the executive, and he truly has become imperial. And the branches, as you pointed out a bit ago, that have the opportunity to check that massive concentration of power, Congress and the courts, are not doing it. And so we're on a steady road, surpassing any historical conception or understanding of the imperial presidency. In fact, I have written in columns that we've entered the Trump's conception of a plebiscitary presidency. Now I'm going to confuse everybody with all these different names. But the plebiscitary presidency is a term that the term plebiscite is derived from early German and Italian authors in the 20th century who simply drew on the experience of Roman emperors and French tyrants who simply ignored any restraints, any laws, and did whatever they wanted, and they were governed solely by what they considered to be the adoration of the public. As long as they had the support of the public, the laws and regulations and any constitutional provisions were irrelevant, meaning once the executive was elected, he was unrestrained. And that's, of course, what President Trump has been doing. Every time he takes an action, he says, well, this is why the American people elected me. Of course, it's not true, but he is asserting that. And so his courtiers, his supporters and various cabinet officials, including the Attorney General, are always engaging in this kind of supportive talk, saying, well, this is why he was elected, and it's okay for him to ignore these statutes. And even his Justice Department has said to ignore court rulings. This is the plebiscitary presidency, which is really the entry point into authoritarianism. That's the road we're traveling.
And kind of related along to that, I'm thinking back when I was undergrad, I was pre-law, and I remember under my amazing professor, Dr. Robert Burns, talking about Marbury versus Madison. Like that was drilled into us. I mean, I think 1803, I think,
Yep.
where the judicial branch is the sole determinant of what the law is. So like, the Congress creates the laws that, but the judiciary is the one that gets to decide, okay, this is cool, this isn't cool. So does the president have the authority to violate the law or defy judiciary orders? Does he have the authority to revise the law? I mean, I think there's so much flooding the zone that we don't even kind of have a firm grasp of what the Constitution actually says.
Right. And that's such an essential point. I'm glad you raised it. And you have a good memory from your days as a student. Marbury, it was decided
He
in
was a
the
great professor.
as you point out, and that's the famous case, and still it remains the most famous landmark case in American history, where Chief Justice John Marshall held that it is emphatically the province and duty of the judiciary to say what the law is. It has the ultimate authority to interpret the Constitution and determine its meaning. And the president, like all other officials, is expected to adhere to the court's rulings, to carry out those judicial determinations and decisions. And the reality is that the framers considered one of their great accomplishments, the subordination of the president to the rule of law. No nation had ever successfully done it. And that's because the executive holds the weapons of law enforcement, and it's been difficult. It was difficult historically to restrain the executive, whether it was a tyrant or otherwise. And so, when we talk about the rule of law in this country, what we're essentially talking about was the subordination of the president to the rule of law, and with that comes the obligation to obey the Constitution, to enforce the laws, and that's the system essentially doubles down on that duty through the oath of office and also, of course, through the take care clause. And that means the president has no authority to ignore, let alone violate, Supreme Court decisions. And most certainly, the president may not revise the meaning of the Constitution, because that would not only represent a gross usurpation of congressional lawmaking power, but worse, more fundamentally, it would represent a usurpation of the power of the people to amend the Constitution. The Constitution can't be changed except through the amendatory clause, which is found in Article 5. And yet, President Trump, who has claimed, by the way, quote, absolute power under Article 2, which is a fantasy, because we have, under our constitutional system, no conception of absolute power or absolute rights. And so that it represents, I think, his philosophy, and he is governed in accordance with that philosophy, that he has absolute authority. and he's continuing to concentrate it as demonstrated by his executive orders.
And I think it was JD Vance made the comment about something to the effect of judges aren't allowed to control the executive's legitimate power. But then it kind of gets into what do you consider legitimate power, right?
Mhm.
There's a question in the chat from Delmer. He says, "Does it make a difference that the president and Congress were democratically elected?"
Yeah, that's a very fine question. In truth, over the years, going back to your good question earlier about the imperial presidency, is that we have seen that it's often the case that when the president is a member of the party that also controls Congress, that we see considerable acquiescence by Congress. I've written a lot on that over the years because what happens is that for party reasons, personal politics, and certainly for partisan reasons, members are loyal to the White House. And it has befuddled me and frustrated me over the years. I've talked to lots of members of Congress about this, members in both parties, and they all say that they feel it their duty to acquiesce to the president. We've seen that particularly in foreign affairs and war making, less so, and in fact, rarely in domestic policy. And so the Trump seizure of power exceeds what other presidents have done or what they've been able to do with the acquiescence of their party leaders in Congress. I don't like it when either party does that because when members of Congress are demonstrating greater loyalty to the party or the president, then that means that they're placing party above country, party above the Constitution. And it ought to be the case that they take seriously their own oath of office to discharge their responsibilities, powers, and duties, and not to be on bended knee toward the executive. So that's why I say we have crossed a line here where the imperial presidency, once pertaining to foreign affairs and national security, now also applies to domestic affairs, marking the fulfillment, as I mentioned, of the plebiscitary presidency, an unrestrained executive, as long as he can cite public support. And that's why yesterday's news about the split in the MAGA movement over the question of whether or not the Epstein file should be released is really a moment to ponder, to ask, is this an ongoing issue? Is this a wedge which will undermine the authority of the president? We'll continue to watch this.
I wanted to take a minute now. Delmer, thank you for putting your question in the chat. If anybody else has a question and you don't want to, raise your hand or whatever, and go ahead and put it in the chat. But I want to open up right now to see if there's any questions at this point in the game. Oh, Delmer has another question. Is what Trump is doing what the American people want?
So that's an interesting question. So the immediate answer, apparently, from all the polls would be no, a resounding no, because we see that Trump is underwater in all the questions raised by polls, from handling the economy to the tariffs, to inflation, to immigration, and so forth. So it's a good question, a really important question to ask. And it's a way of getting at what the people expected of President Trump then and what they expect now. And when we see, for example, that he is underwater in the polls and that even his own party, at least among those polled across the country, disapprove of the way he's handling immigration and deportation, that tells us that he's not doing what the American people want him to do. And I would say that that is an important question to ask, but it also has to be remembered that we live in a constitutional democracy, so that even if the people want the president to violate the Constitution, he has no such authority. What has to be done, of course, is that the president would work to amend the Constitution or would work with Congress in order to change the Constitution to make it more amenable to what the people want. If we were to turn into a system in which the president, for example, would determine that his only compass is obtaining support from the people, then we would abandon entirely the concept of the Constitution and the rule of law. Yeah.
Tara, you have a question?
Yes, I do. You were talking about those oaths that are taken. How seriously are they enforced then? People taking those oaths that are voted into power, and decision making, and then deliberately go against that oath that they've taken. And what can we do then as citizens and as, the voters to, I mean, what can we do on our end? I mean, we see it happening, but what are our responsibilities or our abilities to try to reverse, having those people within, other than waiting for the next vote to come around?
hmm I like that question very much. Thank you. It's a vital question, and it goes right to the heart of the nature of representation in our political system. To the extent that the American people make clear their views, particularly on specific issues and specific policies, to first of all their members of Congress, and that's the branch closest to the people, you would expect that members of Congress would listen very carefully, take very seriously what their constituents are interested in, what they want to accomplish, and then follow that lead. That's the nature of our system of representation. But what we have so often is that members ignore the folks back home. And we see this manifested in so many different ways, not only in how they vote in defiance, let's say, of the views and the wishes of the people. But to make that even more frustrating is when they refuse to hold town hall meetings. So they don't even come back to meet the people, to take the pulse of the people, to hear the questions, to hear their frustrations and concerns, which is vital to the nature of representation. And they're not doing town hall meetings. At least this is true of almost everybody in the GOP, because a memo was sent out months ago. Don't hold town hall meetings because it provides the public with an opportunity to exhibit its frustration and opposition to the Trump policies. And you and I and everybody saw the footage on television. People angry, demonstrating their frustration. So the GOP just decided not to do it. And I wouldn't like that if Democrats were doing that right now. The Democrats are the opposition party, and of course they're doing town halls all over the country, even often going into Republican-controlled districts and holding town hall meetings, which must be somewhat galling to the Republican representative in a district who doesn't have the courage to come out and meet the people. The reason why John Adams echoed the views of the founders in saying that where frequent elections and tyranny begins is the fact of the Congress becoming remote from the people. And one reason, the principal reason why Congress takes all these breaks, and you're all aware of how many vacations and breaks Congress takes, is to go home, to meet the constituents, to hold meetings and consult the views of the people. So it makes a mockery of the idea of all the vacations and breaks that members of Congress take when they either don't come home or they travel elsewhere. When they do come home, they hide. In their office, I can say out here in Idaho, the members don't show up to their local offices because when they have done that, they're visited by large numbers of people trying to get their attention. So uh, the frustration that is so broadly felt across the country is in reality a function of frustration with the failure of members of Congress to meet the people, to take the public pulse. And when you ask rightly, what can we do about it? About our only opportunity to redress this grievance, besides writing letters and calling the offices, is to defeat them at the next election. So our next opportunity would be in 2026, which is just around the corner, right? Just barely a year or so away. And so that's really the opportunity to remedy this situation. And in my own view, it's yet another argument for term limits, which is a position that I adopted some years ago, and I think it's high time to do it. And more demonstrably clear than ever, that we need it, because if people elected to Congress are not going to carry out their constitutional responsibilities and duties, but serve only to serve their own interest, particularly the problem of careerism, then that mocks the system, and it really represents a great deal of cynicism on their part, that they go there not to do the public bidding, not to promote the general welfare, but to promote their own particular interests. Thank you for asking that question.
Hey, Sharon, I'm going to get you in just a second. I wanted to spin off on that a little bit, David, because when the Constitution was written, kind of what they included, the founders included in that, was that their reliance on the integrity of the members of Congress to control themselves and not think about this as a career, but this is what I'm supposed to do because it's right. So we've gone off the rails there, if I'm not mistaken.
You're certainly right, Casey, and off the rails indeed. The reality is nobody during the founding period, and for almost most of our history, ever would have conceived of serving in Congress as a career, largely because it would mean some sacrifices. You would lose opportunities to spend time with your family, grow a business, pursue some sort of professional career if that was your interest, or even to work your farm or your ranch. And so nobody ever thought about a career, because while public service is indeed laudable, admirable, people needed to return home and to tend to their own personal and private matters. But it's become now a source of longevity, an opportunity to create opportunities for themselves after they leave office by becoming well-heeled, well-paid consultants. And this is galling, because you used the word integrity. It demonstrates to me that they lack the integrity, that they begin to use the seat that they've won in order to trade on it for their own particular interest down the road. Yeah.
I personally have wondered how, with a salary of roughly $185,000 a year, when they go into Congress, how they come out millionaires. But I digress. Sharon, did you have a question, my dear?
I like your digressions, Stacy. Some good stock exchange going on, conversation going on among there. Oh, this is kind of piggybacking Tara's question, but just this morning I woke up to hear that the appropriations for National Public Radio, for example, have been canceled. Appropriations which had already been in effect. And I think of all of the dictators who have just one primary source of information, whether it's on the page or in the air, and it just gives me the shivers how closely we're coming to this. That's, I guess, a comment. I don't know.
And actually, related to what you're talking about, Sharon, that was actually a question that I had too, because there's what they call the power of the purse. So does the president have the constitutional power to do that, to withhold the funding appropriated by Congress for any projects or initiatives that he doesn't like? Like you brought up the NEH, and I'm glad you brought up NPR, Sharon, because that's one of the big questions that I really wanted to get to before we ended today. So thank you.
Well, I think it's already touched on that a bit.
Yep, I appreciate you raising that point, and I share your concern as reflected in your comment about funding cuts to NPR and to public television. The reality is, as you point out, in yesterday's vote in the Senate to claw back the money that had been allocated, some $8 billion for for public broadcasting in the form of NPR and PBS support, is really concerning, deeply disturbing, for the reason you pointed out, that people, particularly in rural states, really rely on that. And so it seems to me, a betrayal by congressional representatives in the Senate, by U.S. senators, to claw back that money and to harm those programs where so many people rely on that, particularly on folks on reservations or people in rural areas where there is no other means of communication. You think about the necessity to get public alerts with respect to severe weather, for example. This is why, so that's a deep concern because it seems to undermine the responsibility of Congress to promote the general welfare. And in this case, of course, President Trump would have no authority to refuse to spend the money had been allocated. He asserts an impoundment power, and this is going to go to the Supreme Court. It's preposterous, as we've discussed, because only Congress can determine how to allocate money, and the president has a duty to spend that money. It has no authority to impound it. But the really tragic effect of this vote is that it's going to harm many people in rural states, in rural areas in South Dakota, for example, on reservations, or people in Alaska, for example, where severe weather can cause life-threatening storms. And this is one reason why the two GOP senators who voted against the rescission, against clawing it back, Susan Collins of Maine, lots of rural areas in that state, and of course, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska. But their points were not only the unwisdom of this clawback, but the fact that Congress is essentially not even aware of what is in this bill. And because the director of the OMB, the Office of Management Budget, has not provided any details as to how this money is going to be spent. And so Senator Murkowski said on the floor of the Senate, we're not being asked to consider how to spend the money. We're not being asked to participate in the allocation of the money for particular purposes. We are simply being directed by the White House to pass this bill, leaving to the president the discretion to decide how to spend it. And so this goes to Stacy's point about impoundment and the violation of the appropriations power of Congress. I'll tell you this, when the framers were discussing and debating many provisions of the Constitution, they agreed that there were three principal powers that had to be retained by Congress, or we would cease to be a republic. One was the lawmaking power, had to be carried out by Congress. James Madison said, in a republic, the legislature dominates. The second was the war power, the awesome authority to move the country into war, to declare war, to authorize hostilities, which would run the risk of a huge loss of lives and the destruction of the public treasury. And then third, the appropriations power, because in a republic, it's Congress that has to have that authority. Your representatives in South Dakota, mine here in Idaho, who will make those key decisions how to spend our taxpayer dollars. The framers were engaged, of course, in a revolt against the practice of England, in which the king simply decided how to spend money. And so that was obviously adverse to the interest of a republic. So your comments and Stacy's good question could fill up our entire hour or 2 days or 3 days. So thank you.
And the three points that you just enumerated have all been violated by this administration. All three of them.
Exactly. And so we wonder, to what extent are we truly a republic? Whether we're talking about, as an earlier listener asked, the willingness or unwillingness of members of Congress to listen to the people, hold town hall meetings, cast votes that reflect the concerns of their constituents, or rising to this level of a monumental violation of the appropriations power, the acquiescence by Congress to the president in the seizure, the aggrandizement of the lawmaking power, and of course the usurpation of the war power. The framers' concerns then, as you rightly point out, would seem to answer the question. And we wonder, in what form are we a republic? I have to say, Stacy, we have been plunged into authoritarianism. And we ought not to shrink from using that word. Scholars all over the country who are experts use the term fascism, and that might seem harsh to people, but the reality is, as these leading scholars on authoritarianism and fascism have been writing, they have compared it to what has occurred in authoritarian regimes in the 20th century. And they see the parallels very clearly. And I myself think we are certainly in an authoritarian regime now. And the question is how to pull it back. And, often we look to experts to guide us. If we have ailments, we turn to medical experts, right? And so if we have need for legal advice, we go to lawyers. In this case, the leading experts in this country on fascist regimes, two of which were based at Yale, have left the country. They moved to Toronto. They have said, we've studied the rise of fascism. They were experts on the rise of fascism in Germany, Nazi Germany. They've left the country. A third has left the country because they fear for their loss to speak freely and to write freely. And not everybody, not many will leave the country, undoubtedly, but we can certainly take very seriously. There's serious warnings about the grave way in which our system has changed, some of which we're talking about here today. The steady usurpation of the powers of the other two branches of government, the failure to confront or check this authoritarian presidency, the violation, as we mentioned earlier, of due process of law. And we've not even been able to touch on the violations of free speech and freedom of the press, for example. The effort to attack freedom of the press is taking a direct page out of the playbooks of authoritarians, whether it was Stalin, Hitler, or Orban, now in Hungary, because you remove those institutions which can question your decisions and criticize your decisions. And that's also behind President Trump's war against Ivy League schools and others, trying to bring the universities to heel because that's a source of independent, critical thinking, which we Americans prize. But an authoritarian leader does not want independent, free thinkers who will question their policies and actions.
I think part of it too, when I think back to the quote that I shared at the beginning of by Thomas Jefferson about a well-informed citizenry as being the best defense against tyranny. But if you take away NPR, PBS, the humanities, all of the cultural pieces and institutional pieces, that kind of also dissipates the well-informed citizenry. There's a couple comments here. Tara has a good one here, and this is something I've thought about too. Aren't all of those grounds for impeachment? And we've been through the impeachment thing with this guy before. So
Yes.
what are we looking at?
Well, that comment is so astute. And you're right, we've been through this twice. Trump is twice impeached. And the reality here is that many of Trump's actions now, the usurpation of lawmaking, appropriations, and so forth, the violation of Supreme Court decisions, more than clearly warrant impeachment. But the problem is that Congress is controlled by his party, and the GOP in the House is not about to vote articles of impeachment. And even if it did, the GOP-controlled Senate is not going to vote to convict and remove. And that's very concerning because if you remove the ultimate power of bringing an errant president to heel, which the impeachment power is, then you've lost that vital check. And this is why an authoritarian presidency can keep rising. And the concern here is how far will this go? And if we had more time to talk about the assault now on civil liberties, including free speech and freedom of the press, denial of due process of law. Look, the reality is if ICE officials can abduct people from the streets and whisk them away, and the term is abduction because the practice of the use of the word deportation involves a process. There's no process here. And so it's the wrong term to use. This is abduction, illegal abduction by a governmental agency, ICE, which is now the largest law enforcement agency in America. Its size more than doubles all other law enforcement agencies combined. And it's about to become much bigger and more powerful because Congress has just allocated tens of billions of dollars to increase ICE, which seems not accountable to Congress, only accountable to the president. And that is cause for the deepest sorts of concerns when the president now essentially has his own private army acting at his own beck and call.
Thank you for that. John has an excellent question in the chat too, and this is something that I'm very much looking forward to your response. If the creation of the Doge was illegal, how can that be reversed? A class action suit in federal court to overturn Doge. If Doge was illegal, wouldn't all the actions taken by Doge also be illegal and reversible? And how
Yes.
does that look?
You're right. That's an excellent point. And they are illegal. As I've mentioned, they're unconstitutional. And the remedy is for the courts to hold them unconstitutional and for the president then to rescind all the orders that he's issued under the directives. The problem here is that many people have been fired, some have left. How are you going to rehire them? The largest problem, of course, would be if the courts ordered it, would President Trump follow the order? Because we've seen him violate other orders. And again, that violates your good question earlier about the status of the rule of law. If a president is violating, defying Supreme Court orders, we don't know how much strength is left in the concept of the rule of law. The president is stampeding the rule of law when he violates court orders. And Congress, to that good question, really should have been the first branch to say, wait a minute, you can't engage in the seizure of congressional powers through Doge, lawmaking, appropriations, appointment, etc. But the GOP-controlled Congress has sat on its hands. This is what gives rise to authoritarianism, when the institutions empowered by the Constitution to check presidential power simply ignore it and indeed participate in that rise. That's when we've become engaged in a constitutional crisis and indeed constitutional failure.
Tara has a comment too that I completely agree with. The tax on funding for libraries, education, and trying to erase history has been a scary element this year in our state. I couldn't agree more. The Humanities Council is in a unique situation too, where it's affected us tremendously. For those of you who don't know, in April, all of the appropriations for the Humanities Councils across the state through the NEH, National Endowment for the Humanities, was rescinded overnight through email. So it's something that we felt firsthand here. It's something that we're dealing with too. And it is a scary time for everybody in the libraries and education system. We do have just a few minutes left. So what I want to, my last question is, how can constitutional balance be restored? And what could we do? What can us just everyday Americans, what can we do?
Yeah, thank you. And it's been very enjoyable to be with you again and to take these wonderful questions. I go back to your opening comments on the powerful theme asserted by Thomas Jefferson, that we need an informed citizenry. And that's why a program like this, a program that involves a book festival of the sort that you put on, properly funding libraries, which are critical to informing the public, all of those are important measures to be taken to help create this goal of a well-informed citizenry. And then, of course, the citizenry needs to act by exercising its powers through the assertion of its First Amendment rights. And of course, as Americans everywhere are doing, they engage in these public protests. And the numbers are swelling and are going to continue to swell all across the country, because it is a First Amendment right to protest peacefully. We have to make that clear. And it's what the founders believed was so critical to the maintenance of the Republic. I think that trying to rejuvenate the Congress to assert its own powers to check and balance the president is critical. Because without Congress, without the willingness of Congress to do that, the president will continue to stampede the Constitution. And that begins really with votes for members of Congress who promise to restore the Constitution, to be faithful to the Constitution, to take their oath of office seriously, and then to dispense their responsibilities and duties in a way that comply with the Constitution. And there's no substitute for the American people from coast to coast, lighting a fire under the feet of members of Congress to do precisely that.
We have just a few minutes left. Does anybody have more questions or comments, concerns, contributions? What do we do in the meantime, David? Like, it's still a year. And so look at what's happened in 6 months. So what can we do?
Yes, I think that's the right question to ask, Stacy. The reality is, as I allude again to yesterday's news about a potential split within the MAGA movement, because at this point in time, while the Democrats in both the House and the Senate are waging a good fight, that is, arguing for restoration of the Constitution, adherence to the rule of law, and so forth, they're out of power. And so all of our focus with respect to Congress has to be on the GOP. There's a slim margin in the House, particularly, and members of Congress need to hear from their constituents about their concerns. And the reality here is that we have justifiable grounds for calling and emailing and peppering and bothering members of Congress, whether you live in South Dakota, North Dakota, Minnesota, or any other country when it comes to these cuts that we've talked about to the NEH, to the Humanities Council, to the NPR, to public broadcasting, because these are critically important. The humanities is essential to our education and to understanding the nature of our country, and critical to our culture. And so it takes only a few minutes for everybody watching this program and their friends to begin to call the offices of their congressional representatives. That's one thing. The second is to continue to be informed, and that means following news media that subscribe to the journalistic canons of ethics, that mean that they do their level best to present accurate portrayals of what's occurring, that they adhere to the truth. And third and finally, and I always like to come back to this, Stacy, we want to remember that our founders were children of the Enlightenment. And that meant that they took very seriously the need to engage in discussions and debates that adhered to truth and facts and evidence. While people are going to have different views, of course, because they have different values, and that's just fine, so long as we engage in political discourse in a way that pays serious attention to facts and evidence and the truth, then we're all sitting at a common round table, so to speak, and we can have our honest differences and we can seek common ground, we can find compromise, which is really the engine of democracy. We ought not to forfeit our democracy. We ought not to acquiesce in the face of usurpation of power, certainly should not acquiesce in the face of this rising authoritarianism. Timothy Snyder, one of the Yale historians to whom I referred earlier, who left Yale, moved to Toronto, wrote a wonderful book on tyranny. And among the lessons that he has drawn from the rise of authoritarianism historically was don't obey in advance. Don't comply in advance. We have to assert our First Amendment rights. We should remember that at this point, the office of citizen remains the highest office in this country, and we should insist on adherence to Republican principles and democratic values. That is a requirement for us. And I could just conclude by alluding to Benjamin Franklin's comment at the close of the Constitutional Convention on September 17, 1787, when he left Independence Hall and he was asked by a woman on the street, "Tell us, Dr. Franklin, what kind of a system of government have you given us, a monarchy or a republic?" And he looked at her and he said, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it." That was a gift from the founders. They were a brave generation. They risked their lives, obviously, in signing the Declaration of Independence because that was an act of treason against the crown. And then they continued their courage to fashion a republic that finally became the envy of the world. We ought not to betray the earnest efforts of the founders, or indeed all those who have fought for America in 2 world wars and other wars to defend American ideals, constitutional freedoms, democratic values, by turning our backs on their efforts, their sacrifice, by acquiescing to the rise of authoritarianism. We owe previous generations that debt of gratitude. Thank you.
Thank you, David. That's a great summation, because I think that in a nutshell, that's what we need to hold on to. We are up against that 1 o'clock hour, so I do want to thank you all for joining us. I included in the comments a survey for you in the chat, a survey for you to complete if you're so inclined. But I hope in a couple weeks you'll be able to join us again, because we're going to extend this conversation a little bit more. We're going to talk about media literacy and informational literacy, and how those 2 things are related. They're not the same thing, but they're very closely related, and they're directly related to being a part of an informed citizenry. So I hope that you can join us again in a couple weeks when we continue this conversation a little bit. Thank you very much, David, for again joining us. I hope we get to do this again soon, and I hope things are looking up by then. Thank you all for joining us. Hope to see you in a couple weeks. In the meantime, enjoy your summertime. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Stacy. Goodbye.